The courtroom was filled with tension. Every eye was fixed on the lawyer who had just delivered the final, crushing blow. Ruthless, manipulative, and relentless, this lawyer was known for intimidating anyone who dared cross him. And today, his victim was none other than the key witness in a high-profile murder case, Diane Harper. Diane, a soft-spoken woman, was trembling in the witness box. Her voice quivered as she tried to answer the lawyer's sharp, cutting questions. But every time she spoke, Daniel Carter, the defense lawyer, shot back with cruel words designed to break her spirit. His tone was cold, his eyes piercing, like a predator toying with its prey. "You're lying, Ms. Harper," Daniel said with a smirk, his voice echoing through the courtroom. "You've been coached, haven't you? Someone put you up to this, just like they put you up to your testimony. You're nothing but a pawn in their game." The crowd gasped at his words, but Diane didn't respond immediately. She just stared down at her hands, trying to steady her breath, afraid of what might happen next. It was clear that Daniel was trying to intimidate her, to make her crack under pressure. But Diane had something he didn't know about, something that would soon change the course of the trial. Suddenly, Diane reached into her bag and pulled out a small tape recorder. The courtroom fell silent as everyone watched her, unsure of what she was doing. Diane's hands shook as she pressed the play button. The voice that came through the speakers made Daniel's blood run cold. It was unmistakable, his own voice, from a private conversation he thought was safe. "Don't worry, Diane," the recording said. "If you testify against my client, I'll make sure you regret it. No one will believe you. You're done." The room went dead silent. The judge, who had been overseeing the case with a calm demeanor, was now visibly stunned. The jury's faces reflected shock, while the prosecution looked like they had just won the lottery. But Daniel? His face drained of color. He stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. But that wasn't all. Diane wasn't finished yet. She hit play again, and the next part of the recording filled the room. "You'll be lucky if you even make it to the witness stand. I have ways of making people disappear. You've been warned, Diane." The courtroom erupted into chaos. The bailiff had to step forward to maintain order, as people began whispering, gasping, and pointing. Some people couldn't believe it. Others were already muttering about the implications of the recording. But one thing was clear. Daniel had just been exposed, and there was no going back. His lawyerly composure had evaporated in an instant. He looked around the room as if he might flee, but his feet remained planted. How had this happened? How had Diane come prepared with such irrefutable evidence? And why had no one known about it until now? Diane's face remained calm, almost defiant. But inside, she felt a surge of pride and relief. She had finally taken control of her own fate. The threat that had loomed over her for so long was no longer something she had to fear. But Daniel's expression was something else entirely. It was a mix of shock, anger, and panic. For a moment, it looked like the whole courtroom might explode with questions. But before anyone could speak, the judge slammed his gavel down with authority. "Order," he barked. "Miss Harper, I want to hear everything you know." Mr. Carter stepped down from the defense table immediately. "We'll be having a word after this." Daniel didn't move at first, but the reality was sinking in. He could feel the eyes of everyone on him. Eyes that once saw him as a top-tier lawyer, a master of manipulation, now seeing him as a criminal. What was going to happen next? Would Daniel be arrested on the spot? Could the case be overturned? And what had made Diane finally come forward with the truth? The answers seemed just out of reach. But let's rewind a little. How did it all come to this? Diane Harper had never imagined herself in a courtroom. She had always been a quiet woman, living in a small house in a sleepy neighborhood in Arizona. Her days were simple, filled with mundane tasks like grocery shopping, walking her dog, and keeping her garden tidy. She had no interest in being involved in anything that would draw attention, especially not a murder trial. But her life had changed the day she witnessed something she shouldn't have. It all started a few months ago. Diane had been walking her dog, Winston, down the street when she had seen something through the window of a house she passed by. It was a man, a familiar face from the local community, Daniel Carter, the same lawyer who now stood in the defense box, trying to intimidate her. At first, Diane thought she was imagining things. But then, she saw it again. The same man, talking to another person, his voice muffled by the thick curtains, but his gestures unmistakable. They were making deals, dark deals that didn't seem right. Diane didn't know what she had witnessed, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Soon after, she started receiving strange messages, threats, taunts, and warnings. The voice on the other end was always distorted, but she knew who it was. Daniel Carter. She had been careful, never answering, but she couldn't escape the anxiety that gnawed at her. She knew she had to do something. But what could one woman do against a lawyer who was so powerful, so connected, so dangerous? Diane's fear was palpable. But one night, after receiving yet another threatening message, she made a decision that would change everything. She called an old friend, a tech-savvy man named Jake, and asked him to help her. She needed a way to record these threats, to have proof, to defend herself if it ever came to that. Jake was hesitant at first, but eventually agreed to help. Together, they set up a plan. Jake would send her a small, hidden recording device, one that she could carry with her without Daniel ever knowing. They also rigged her phone with an app that could automatically record any phone calls that came through. What Diane didn't know was that this small act of bravery would set off a chain of events that she could never have predicted. As the weeks passed, Diane kept a low profile, knowing that Daniel was watching. But she remained calm, gathering evidence, biding her time. She knew that someday, she'd have to face him, and when she did, she wanted to be ready. And today, that day had finally come. Now, the courtroom was filled with whispers, as the consequences of her actions were beginning to take shape. But would this be the end of the story? Or was it just the beginning of something far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined? The tension in the air was thick. Would Diane's courage be enough to take down a man like Daniel? Or would she become his next target? Only time would tell. Diane felt a strange sense of calm wash over her as the courtroom buzzed with activity. The gavel had been struck, but the echoes of her revelation still lingered in the air. The murmurs and whispers among the spectators were deafening, but all she could hear was her heartbeat pounding in her chest. She had done it. She had finally exposed Daniel Carter for who he truly was. But what now? What would happen next? She hadn't prepared for this level of attention, this level of scrutiny. She had simply wanted to protect herself, but now, she had exposed a ruthless man in front of the entire courtroom, and she had no idea what would happen next. For the first time since the trial began, Diane let herself take a deep breath. The weight on her shoulders felt slightly lighter. She glanced at her attorney, Mark Sullivan, who had been standing next to her during the entire ordeal. His eyes met hers, and he offered her a brief but reassuring smile. "You did the right thing, Diane," Mark said, his voice low, so only she could hear. Diane nodded, though she could feel her hands still shaking. She had never been in the spotlight before, never had to deal with something as serious as this. She thought back to the quiet days of walking Winston, her dog, in the neighborhood. Those days felt like a distant memory now. The judge had ordered a recess, giving everyone time to process the explosive moment. The jury had been excused to deliberate, and the defense had been told to meet in the chambers. It was as if the entire room had shifted in an instant, and Diane was at the center of it all. As she walked to the back of the courtroom with Mark, a flood of emotions overwhelmed her. She felt proud of herself for standing up to Daniel, but she also felt the weight of the consequences. What if Daniel retaliated? What if his connections were too powerful? What if her life would never be the same again? Mark's voice broke through her thoughts. "I know this is overwhelming, Diane, but you did what was right. You're a hero." Diane didn't feel like a hero. She felt like a regular woman who had been forced into an extraordinary situation. She had never asked for any of this. As they walked down the corridor, heading toward the courtroom exit, Diane noticed a familiar face. It was Jake, her old friend who had helped her set up the recording device. He was waiting by the door, a concerned look on his face. "Diane," Jake said, rushing to her. "Are you okay? I saw what happened in there. That was incredible." Diane smiled weakly at him, grateful for his support. "I'm fine, Jake. Just trying to process everything." Jake placed a hand on her shoulder, his eyes filled with concern. I know this is a lot to handle, but we've got to stay smart. This is far from over. Diane nodded, her heart sinking. She knew he was right. Exposing Daniel was just the beginning. She had no idea what kind of retaliation he might have in store for her. As they stepped outside the courthouse, the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the parking lot. The cool evening air felt strangely comforting, but the quiet was short-lived. A black SUV pulled up next to them, its tinted windows giving no clue as to who was inside. The driver rolled down the window, and Diane's heart skipped a beat when she saw who it was. It was Daniel. His cold eyes locked onto hers, and he didn't say a word. He just stared at her with a look that sent chills down her spine. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Diane's breath caught in her throat. What was he doing here? Was this a threat? Was he about to do something reckless? She instinctively stepped back, but Mark stood firm beside her. "Mr. Carter," Mark said, his voice steady, but there was an edge to it. "You've had your day in court. We'll be seeing you in front of the judge soon." Daniel didn't respond immediately. He just kept his gaze fixed on Diane, as if weighing her very soul. Then, without a word, he rolled the window back up and drove off, disappearing into the streets. Diane let out the breath she didn't even realize she was holding. "What was that about?" she whispered. Mark's expression was unreadable. "I don't know, but I don't trust it." Jake, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "That was unsettling. We have to be careful, Diane. This isn't over." Diane could feel her nerves returning. The whole situation was spiraling out of control. She had thought that revealing the recordings would be the end of it, that the truth would be enough to bring Daniel down. But now, she realized just how dangerous things had become. Her hands began to shake again, but she forced herself to steady them. "What should I do now?" Mark placed a hand on her arm. "Stay close. Don't make any sudden moves. We'll get through this." But deep down, Diane knew it wasn't going to be that simple. Daniel wasn't a man to be intimidated, not by a witness, not by anyone. She had seen the coldness in his eyes. She had exposed him, yes, but now she had made herself a target. That night, Diane could barely sleep. Every noise outside her window felt like a potential threat. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering what Daniel would do next. Would he try to discredit her testimony? Would he try to silence her, to make her disappear, just like he'd threatened on the recording? She couldn't be sure. But one thing was certain. This battle was far from over. The next morning, Diane woke to a call that made her stomach churn. It was from an unknown number, but the voice on the other end was unmistakable. "Ms. Harper," Daniel's voice was low, dangerous. "You've made a grave mistake. You think you've won, but this is far from over. You'll regret this, I promise you." Diane's blood ran cold. The recording had only been the beginning of his threats. Now, she was really in danger. As she hung up the phone, a chilling thought crossed her mind. Was she safe even in her own home? Would the next threat come in the dead of night? The fear that had been lurking in the back of her mind now crept forward, and Diane realized that she might have just opened a door that she could never close again. The next few days felt like a whirlwind. Diane's life had shifted completely, and she had no idea where it was headed. The courtroom drama, the shocking revelation of Daniel's threats, it had all been so sudden, so overwhelming. But as each hour passed, the consequences of her actions became more real, more dangerous. Her phone had been ringing off the hook with calls from reporters, family members, and even random strangers who wanted to offer their opinions on what had happened. Everyone had something to say. Everyone had their own version of what Diane had done and why she did it. But the one person she hadn't heard from was Daniel. It was as if he had vanished into thin air after his ominous words in the parking lot. The silence was unnerving. Diane couldn't decide whether it was a good sign or a bad one. Did it mean he was regrouping, plotting something more sinister, or was it just the calm before the storm? Mark, her lawyer, had told her to be cautious and stay out of the public eye for a while. "Lay low," he said, "until we know what Daniel's next move is. We don't want to give him any reason to escalate things." But laying low was hard for Diane. She couldn't stop thinking about the threats. The voice on the recording still echoed in her mind. She couldn't forget the menacing tone when Daniel had said, "You'll regret this, I promise you. In an attempt to find some sense of normalcy, Diane decided to go for a walk with Winston, her dog. The fresh air always helped her think, and the rhythmic sound of Winston's paws on the pavement was a comfort. She hadn't taken him on a walk in days, and she knew he missed it. But as she walked through the neighborhood, Diane couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She kept glancing over her shoulder, but each time she turned, there was nothing. No black SUV. No figure lurking in the shadows. Still, the feeling gnawed at her. It was like her instincts were telling her that something was off. But what could she do? She couldn't just lock herself indoors forever, hiding from a man she had already exposed. Later that night, as Diane was sitting in her living room, her phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a call. It was a message, an encrypted text. Diane's heart raced as she opened it. The message was short, but the impact was immediate. You won't be safe for long, Diane. The game has only just begun. Don't think you're untouchable now. She stared at the message, her mind spinning. It wasn't the first threatening message she had received from Daniel, but something about this one felt different. It felt more personal, more dangerous. She felt a shiver run down her spine. Was he watching her? Was he close? Was he planning something even worse? She immediately called Mark, her lawyer, but it went straight to voicemail. Mark, it's Diane. I just got another message from Daniel. I don't know what he's planning, but I feel like he's getting closer. I need your help. Please call me back. After a few minutes of pacing around her living room, Diane began to feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. The walls of her house felt thinner, the shadows darker. She couldn't stay in her home any longer, not with these threats hanging over her head. That night, she decided to leave. She packed a small bag, just the essentials, nothing more. Winston was already at her side, wagging his tail, oblivious to the danger lurking in the background. But Diane wasn't oblivious. She knew that staying in her house was no longer an option. If Daniel really was after her, she couldn't risk being an easy target. She left her house quietly, making sure the doors were locked, the lights turned off. As she slipped into her car, she couldn't help but wonder how far Daniel would go. Would he follow her? Would he find her wherever she went? As she drove, Diane tried to think of her options. She could call the police, but she didn't know if they would take her seriously. After all, she had no concrete evidence that Daniel was behind the threats, just the ominous recordings and his cryptic messages. It wasn't enough to guarantee her safety. Her phone buzzed again. It was Mark. Diane, I just got your message, Mark said, his voice urgent. Listen to me carefully. You need to be cautious. Daniel won't stop, not after what you've done. If he's threatening you, it's serious. But right now, the most important thing is to stay out of sight. Don't go back home. I'll make some calls, try to get extra protection for you. But you need to be careful, okay? Diane nodded, even though Mark couldn't see her. I'm already on the road. I don't know where to go, Mark. I feel like I'm running away from something I can't escape. Stay calm, Diane. We'll figure this out. Just don't trust anyone right now, especially if they claim to be helping you. Daniel has his connections. You need to stay alert. The words hit Diane like a punch in the gut. Don't trust anyone. That was the last thing she wanted to hear. But Mark's warning echoed in her mind as she continued to drive into the unknown. Who could she trust? Who could she turn to when everyone seemed to be a potential threat? As she turned down an unfamiliar street, she suddenly saw a car pull up behind her, its headlights blinding her in the rearview mirror. Her heart skipped a beat. It wasn't just any car. It was a black SUV. The same kind of SUV she had seen before. Could it be Daniel? She couldn't be sure, but her instincts told her to drive faster. She pressed her foot harder on the gas pedal, weaving through traffic, desperately trying to shake off the tailing vehicle. But the SUV didn't back off. It stayed right behind her, following her at every turn, every lane change. Diane's mind raced. Should she call the police? Should she keep driving? Her breath quickened as she looked for a safe place to pull over. She had to make a decision quickly. Then, just as she was about to take a sharp turn into a parking lot, the SUV suddenly swerved to block her. Diane's heart pounded in her chest. She slammed on the brakes, narrowly avoiding a collision. The SUV was now directly in front of her, and a man stepped out of the car, his face hidden in the shadows. Was it Daniel? Was it someone else working for him? Diane's pulse raced as the man approached her car, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. She couldn't tell if he was carrying a weapon or if he was just here to intimidate her. All she knew was that this was the moment her life could change forever. Would she make it out of this alive? Or was this the end of the road for Diane Harper? The man stopped just a few feet away from her window, and in the dim light, she could finally see his face. It wasn't Daniel. But who was he? What did he want? And why had he been following her? The answers to those questions were just out of reach. The man raised his hand, signaling for her to roll down the window. "Miss Harper," he said, his voice cold and clipped, "we need to talk." Diane's breath caught in her throat. What now? Diane's heart pounded in her chest as she stared at the man standing just outside her car window. His cold, emotionless eyes studied her with a level of intensity that made her skin crawl. She couldn't place his face. He wasn't someone she recognized, but she had no doubt that he was connected to Daniel in some way. The black SUV, the darkened alley, the sudden appearance of this stranger. Everything felt like a trap. She could hear Winston, her dog, softly whining in the back seat, sensing her unease. Diane swallowed hard, trying to steady her breath. The man's hand was still raised, signaling her to roll down the window, but something in his posture, his confidence, his calm demeanor, told her that he was used to intimidating people. For a moment, Diane considered driving away. But the man was blocking her path, and he was standing too close. Even if she tried to swerve around him, the risk of hitting him or making the situation worse was too high. She had to face this head-on. With trembling hands, she slowly pressed the button to roll down the window. The man didn't flinch, didn't take a step back, just stood there, waiting for her to comply. "Miss Harper," he began, his voice smooth but chilling, "I think you know who I work for." His words were not a question, but a statement of fact. Diane felt a wave of dread wash over her. It was clear now. This man was connected to Daniel. But how? "I don't know what you want from me," Diane said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I've already told the truth. I've done what's right." The man's lips curled into a slight smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You don't get it, do you?" he said, leaning in slightly. "It's not about what's right. It's about what's convenient. And right now, you're not convenient for anyone." Diane's mind raced. Convenient for anyone? What did that mean? She could feel the sweat starting to form on her forehead, the rising panic that threatened to overwhelm her. "Listen to me," the man continued, his tone calm but heavy with an underlying threat. "Daniel is frustrated. He's not used to people like you getting in his way. People like you who think they can just waltz into his world and expose him for what he is." He paused, and Diane's stomach twisted in knots. "But here's the thing. Daniel doesn't make mistakes. He doesn't leave loose ends." Diane felt her heart skip a beat. Was he threatening her life? Was this man here to silence her? She didn't know if she could handle any more of this. The pressure, the fear, the uncertainty. It was too much. She needed to keep calm, to think clearly. She forced herself to focus, to block out the paralyzing fear that was creeping up her spine. "What do you want from me?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped back slightly, as if inspecting her. He didn't seem in any hurry, and that unnerved Diane even more. Then, he spoke again, his words deliberate. "We want you to disappear. Completely. Leave town. Get out of our way, and this will all go away. Daniel will drop the charges. You'll have no more problems." The offer was simple, but Diane could feel the weight of it. It wasn't really an offer at all. It was a demand, and the underlying threat was clear. If she didn't comply, things would only get worse. "Or what?" Diane asked, her voice shaky but defiant. "What happens if I don't leave?" The man's smile widened, but it was not a comforting smile. It was the kind of smile you might see on a predator before it closed in on its prey. "Then," he said, leaning in even closer, "you'll regret it. You'll wish you had. You have no idea the kind of people Daniel is connected to. He can make your life a living nightmare. He can make you disappear, just like that." He snapped his fingers for emphasis, making Diane flinch. She wanted to scream. She wanted to fight back, but the fear gripped her chest. She thought of her family, her friends, her life. She had worked so hard to build something for herself, and now, here was this man threatening to take it all away. "Do yourself a favor, Miss Harper," the man said, his voice now low and coaxing, almost like he was offering her a lifeline. "You walk away from this, and you can have your life back. You can keep your job, your home, your future. But keep pushing, and you'll find that everything you've worked for can be wiped out in the blink of an eye." The words stung, but they were not the only thing that rattled her. The chilling truth was becoming clear. This wasn't just a lawyer playing dirty games in court. This was something far darker. Daniel had connections, real power, and it didn't look like he had any hesitation in using them. Diane swallowed hard, the weight of his words sinking in. But she wasn't going to give in. She couldn't. This was about more than just her safety. It was about standing up to someone who thought they could control everyone around them. She had to be strong. She had to be brave. "I won't back down," Diane said, her voice firm, though her hands trembled on the steering wheel. "I'm not going anywhere." For the first time, the man's smile faltered. He straightened up, his eyes narrowing. "I was hoping you'd say that," he said coldly. "It's unfortunate, really, because now, things are going to get much harder for you." Without another word, the man stepped back and returned to his SUV. Diane watched in the rearview mirror as he climbed into the driver's seat and sped off, disappearing down the street. For a few moments, Diane just sat there in stunned silence. She didn't know if she felt relief or even more terrified. He was gone, yes, but the threat was still there, looming over her like a dark cloud. She had made her choice, but now she had to live with it. She gripped the steering wheel tightly, trying to keep her composure. What now? She couldn't go back home. She couldn't just wait for Daniel's next move. She had to find a way to protect herself. As she drove through the quiet streets, her mind raced. She couldn't trust anyone connected to Daniel, but she needed help. She couldn't do this alone. The only question was, who could she trust? And then, just as Diane thought she might have a plan, her phone buzzed again. It was a message, this time, from an unknown number. "You're in over your head, Diane. You've made a powerful enemy, but there's someone who can help you. Meet me tonight at 8 p.m. at the old diner on Maple Street. Come alone. Don't tell anyone. Trust no one." Diane froze. Could this be a trap? Or was this the lifeline she had been waiting for? The mystery deepened, and the clock was ticking. The message lingered on Diane's phone screen, each word pressing into her mind like a weight. Trust no one. The phrase echoed in her head, the implications of it gnawing at her. Who could this mysterious person be? A part of her wanted to ignore it, to block the message, and just drive away. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that she had no choice. She couldn't keep running. She had to face this head-on, no matter how dangerous it was. The diner on Maple Street was a spot Diane knew well. It was a small, retro place, known for its thick milkshakes and greasy fries. It wasn't a place where shady deals typically went down, but the idea of meeting someone there at night, alone, seemed more than a little risky. Still, something about the message rang true. If there was someone who could help her, someone who had the power to stand up to Daniel and his threats, Diane needed to find out who they were. She didn't waste any time. Diane drove straight to Maple Street, her thoughts swirling as she kept her eyes on the road. Her mind raced with possibilities. What if this was a trap? What if Daniel had set this up to lure her in? What if she was walking right into another ambush? But the message had promised help, not harm. It felt different from the threats Daniel had made. As she drove, Diane kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the black SUV tailing her again. But there was nothing. The streets were empty, the city quiet at this late hour. It almost felt like the calm before a storm. When she finally arrived at the diner, Diane parked her car and took a deep breath. The neon sign flickered in the distance, casting a pale glow on the empty lot. The diner was nearly deserted, save for a single light that shone from the window, illuminating a small table in the back. It felt strange, almost eerie. The message had told her to come alone, and that's exactly what she did. She sat in the car for a few moments, staring at the diner's front door. What if it was a setup? What if someone inside was waiting to hurt her? But then, she remembered why she had come here in the first place. She couldn't live in fear. She had to take the risk. Diane gathered her courage, stepped out of the car, and walked to the door. The bell above the door rang as she entered, and the warm, greasy smell of fried food hit her instantly. The waitress behind the counter glanced up but didn't seem to recognize Diane. There were a few scattered patrons, but no one was paying her much attention. Her eyes scanned the diner, landing on the table in the back. A figure sat there, their face obscured by shadows. Diane hesitated for a moment, then made her way toward the table, her footsteps echoing on the tile floor. When she reached the table, the person didn't immediately speak. They simply motioned for her to sit down. Diane cautiously lowered herself into the chair across from them, her nerves tightening. The figure finally leaned forward, revealing a face that was strangely familiar. It was Jake. Diane blinked in surprise. "Jake? What are you doing here?" she whispered, leaning in. "I didn't expect." Jake cut her off, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't want to involve you, Diane, but I didn't have a choice. Things are worse than you realize. Daniel's not just a lawyer. He's part of something much bigger, something dangerous." Diane's stomach twisted. She had suspected Daniel had connections, but this was something new, something even more sinister. "Bigger?" Diane repeated, her voice shaking. "What are you talking about? Who else is he involved with?" Jake leaned in even closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I've been trying to warn you for weeks. Daniel's tied to a network of powerful people. They pull strings behind the scenes, influence everything. Business, politics, even law enforcement. You've exposed him, and now you've become a target. They won't stop until they've silenced you." Diane's breath caught in her throat. This was far beyond anything she had imagined. All this time, she had thought Daniel was just a corrupt lawyer, someone who was manipulating the system for his own gain. But now, she realized that he was part of something much darker, something that could ruin everything she held dear. Jake's face softened. "I know you're scared. I don't blame you. But you can't trust anyone who works for Daniel. They're all connected. You're not safe here anymore. I've been working on a plan to help you, but it's going to be dangerous." Diane sat back, her mind reeling. "Why didn't you tell me this sooner? Why didn't you warn me?" Jake looked guilty, his eyes darting around the diner. "I didn't want to get you involved, Diane. I didn't want to put you in danger. But when you got that recording, when you made the decision to testify, I knew there was no turning back. I couldn't stand by and watch you get crushed." Diane was silent for a moment, trying to absorb everything he had just told her. She had never imagined that Daniel's empire stretched this far, that his reach was this powerful. She had thought that by exposing him, by revealing the truth, she would be safe. But now, everything had changed. "Jake, what do we do now?" she asked, her voice breaking. "How do we stop him? How do we fight back against something so big?" Jake's expression hardened, determination flashing in his eyes. "We fight fire with fire. I've got some connections, people who can help us, but we need to move quickly. Daniel's not going to let this go. If we don't act now, it might be too late." Diane's mind raced as she considered Jake's words. She couldn't sit idly by anymore. She had to take control of her own fate, no matter how terrifying it was. But with Daniel's vast network of influence, could they really stop him? Could she ever be truly safe again? Before she could respond, a sound interrupted their conversation. The door to the diner creaked open, and Diane's stomach dropped as she saw who had just entered. It was Daniel. He stood just inside the door, his eyes scanning the room. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Everyone in the diner seemed to hold their breath, sensing the tension in the air. Daniel's gaze landed on Diane, and his lips curled into a wicked smile. He had been watching them this entire time. Diane's blood ran cold as he slowly walked toward their table, his footsteps echoing in the silence. She had no idea how he had found her, but she knew one thing for sure. Things were about to get much worse. Daniel reached the table and looked down at them with disdain. "I was wondering when you two would show up," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "Did you really think you could hide from me? Jake stood up, but Daniel's cold gaze stopped him in his tracks. The two men stared at each other for a long, tense moment. "I won't let you get away with this," Daniel said, his voice low and threatening. "You've crossed a line, Diane. And now, I'm going to make sure you regret it." Diane's heart raced as she realized there was no escape. Daniel was here, in the diner, and he wasn't leaving without getting what he wanted. The question was, what would he do to her next? The air in the diner felt suffocating, as though it were closing in around Diane. Her palms were sweaty, her throat dry, and her heart raced in her chest. Daniel stood before them, his presence commanding, like a predator eyeing its prey. The diner, once a quiet, peaceful place, now felt like a battlefield, and Diane was caught in the middle. Jake remained standing, his posture stiff, his jaw clenched. He didn't look afraid, but Diane could sense the tension in his body. He was preparing for whatever was coming next. She, on the other hand, felt like her legs might give way beneath her. The weight of Daniel's gaze was like a physical force, and she could see the anger simmering beneath the surface. "Did you really think you could outsmart me, Diane?" Daniel's voice was cold, devoid of any empathy. "You think this little act of defiance will make you a hero? You're nothing but a pawn in a game you don't understand." Diane clenched her fists under the table, trying to hold onto her composure. "Stay calm, stay strong." She repeated the mantra in her mind. She wasn't going to let him break her. "Is that what you tell yourself, Daniel?" Diane said, her voice steady but filled with quiet defiance. "That I'm just a pawn? A pawn in your corrupt game? Well, I'm not backing down. Not now, not ever." Daniel's lips curled into a smile, but it was a smile that sent a chill through Diane's spine. "You really think you have a choice in this? You think this is all just about you and your little recording? You've exposed me, Diane, but you've made a mistake. Now, you'll have to live with it." Jake stepped forward, his eyes locked on Daniel. "You're wrong, Daniel. This isn't just about you. It's about the truth. And no matter how much you threaten, no matter how much you try to intimidate her, the truth will come out. You can't hide behind your lies forever." Daniel's gaze flickered briefly to Jake, but his attention quickly returned to Diane. "You think you're in control? You're not. I'm in control here, and I always have been." Diane could feel the tension in the air, thick enough to suffocate. She wasn't sure how much longer she could stand her ground, but she couldn't back down. She had come too far. She had exposed him, and she wasn't about to let him intimidate her into silence. "I don't care what you think," Diane said, her voice gaining strength. "I won't be your puppet. I've already made my choice, and I'm not going back." For a moment, Daniel didn't speak. He just stared at her, as if weighing her words. Then, with a slight tilt of his head, he let out a low chuckle. "Brave words, Diane. But bravery doesn't change anything. You've made your stand, but it's too late now. You think you're untouchable, but you're not. You've made a powerful enemy, and that's something you can't undo." Jake stepped in front of Diane, his body tense with anger. "You don't get it, Daniel," he said, his voice sharp. "You're not invincible. Your time is running out. People like you always fall in the end." Daniel's smile vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating expression. "We'll see about that," he said, his voice low and dangerous. He turned on his heel and began to walk toward the door. "But remember this, Diane. You've made your choice, and now you'll pay the price." As the door to the diner swung open, Daniel paused, turning back to look at Diane one last time. His eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. "Don't think for a second that you're safe," he said, his voice a whisper but carrying a threat that sent shivers down Diane's spine. "This is far from over." And with that, he was gone. The door slammed shut behind him, and the diner fell silent once more. Diane let out a shaky breath, feeling the weight of the moment press down on her. She had survived this encounter, but what had Daniel meant by pay the price? The fear that had been growing in her chest seemed to swell, but she pushed it down. She wasn't going to let him control her. She couldn't. Jake sat back down across from her, his expression serious, but not without a trace of concern. "You handled yourself well," he said, his voice quiet. "But don't underestimate him, Diane. He's not just a lawyer. He's part of something bigger, something dangerous. I know, Diane replied, her voice barely a whisper. I know now, and I'm not backing down. But as she said the words, a nagging doubt started to creep into her mind. What had Daniel meant by "you'll pay the price"? Was this just another empty threat? Or was it something more? Diane couldn't shake the feeling that Daniel wasn't finished with her yet. In fact, she was certain this was just the beginning. Jake leaned forward, his tone serious. We need to move fast, Diane. You're not safe here. I can't protect you forever. You need to get out of town, go somewhere they won't expect. I can't just run away, Diane said, shaking her head. That's what Daniel wants. He wants me to be afraid, to hide. But I won't give him that satisfaction. Jake sighed, running a hand through his hair. I get it, but you can't fight this alone. You need help, and you need to be smart about it. I know, but where do I go from here? What do I do? Jake hesitated for a moment, then leaned in closer. I know someone who can help, someone who's dealt with people like Daniel before. They have the resources, the connections. But you have to trust them. Diane's mind raced. Could she trust Jake's contact? Could she trust anyone at this point? She had already put herself in danger by testifying, by exposing Daniel. But she couldn't back down now. Who is it? She asked, her voice steady but filled with uncertainty. Jake looked over his shoulder to make sure no one was listening, then whispered, I'll give you the name, but you have to meet them in person. No phones, no trace. Just you alone. It's the only way. Diane's heart pounded. She had no idea what she was getting herself into, but the more she thought about it, the more she realized there was no other choice. If she was going to survive this, she needed all the help she could get. I'll do it, Diane said, her voice resolute. I'll meet them. Jake nodded, his expression unreadable. It's the right move. But be careful, Diane. You have no idea who you're getting involved with. Diane's mind was spinning. She had no idea what would happen next, but one thing was clear. Her life was about to get even more dangerous. But there was no turning back. She had made a stand, and now she was going to see it through, no matter the cost. As she walked out of the diner, the weight of the decision settled on her shoulders. The next step was unknown, but she was ready. Whatever Daniel had planned, whatever his threats meant, she wasn't going to let him win. She was going to fight back. The air outside the diner was cold, a sharp wind cutting through Diane's coat as she stepped into the night. She didn't feel the chill, though. Her mind was racing, and her thoughts were so tangled that she couldn't focus on anything except what Jake had told her. She had made the decision. She had agreed to meet Jake's contact, but she had no idea what to expect, who to trust, or what kind of danger she was about to walk into. As Diane walked to her car, she kept her head down, making sure no one followed her. The streets were nearly empty, but the silence felt ominous, like the calm before a storm. The diner had been the last place she expected to face Daniel, but now she had to wonder. Had he been watching her even then? Had he sent someone after her? Every shadow, every car that passed seemed like a potential threat. She needed to focus. She couldn't let fear control her. Diane slid into her car, started the engine, and drove off, her eyes constantly scanning the rearview mirror. She was heading for a secluded spot on the outskirts of town, a place Jake had said would be safer for the meeting. The headlights from other cars blurred in her vision as she drove, the sound of tires on the road a dull hum in the background. Diane's heart pounded with every mile. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that she was walking into something far deeper than she could imagine. The address Jake had given her wasn't far, but it felt like a lifetime before she reached it. When she finally turned off the main road, the trees loomed tall and dark around her. The small building at the end of the dirt road stood alone in the darkness. It looked abandoned, its windows boarded up and its doors shut tight. Diane parked her car a few yards away from the building, the engine's soft hum still echoing in the night. She took a deep breath before getting out, feeling the weight of the silence press down on her. The only sounds were the distant chirping of crickets and the rustling of leaves in the wind. The building in front of her was almost a shadow itself. It seemed like an old, forgotten warehouse. No sign of life, no indication that anyone was there. But she knew better than to assume safety. She had come this far, and she couldn't turn back now. Diane walked toward the entrance, her steps slow and measured. The door creaked as she pushed it open, revealing a dimly lit room inside. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, casting long shadows across the room. There was no one in sight. "Hello?" Diane called out softly, her voice echoing in the emptiness. She didn't know what to expect. Was this a trap? Was this some kind of trick to get her alone, to take advantage of her desperation? A sudden movement caught her eye, and Diane whipped around, her heart in her throat. But it wasn't a threat. A figure emerged from the shadows, stepping into the weak light. It was a woman, dressed in all black, with a dark scarf wrapped around her head. She was tall and slender, her features sharp, her expression unreadable. Diane's breath hitched as the woman approached, her steps confident but cautious. She didn't speak at first, just regarded Diane with piercing eyes. Finally, she stopped a few feet in front of her and spoke in a low, controlled voice. "You must be Diane," the woman said, her tone calm but with an edge that made Diane uneasy. "Jake said you needed help. I'm the one who can provide it." Diane's mind raced. She had no idea who this woman was or how she was connected to Jake. Was this really the person who could help her? Or was this another one of Daniel's pawns, trying to play both sides? "Who are you?" Diane asked, her voice steady but guarded. The woman didn't answer immediately. Instead, she studied Diane, as if sizing her up. Then, after a long pause, she said, "I'm someone who has been keeping an eye on Daniel, someone who knows how dangerous he really is. And I've been waiting for someone like you." Diane's pulse quickened. "Someone like me?" The woman took a step closer, lowering her voice so it was barely audible. "I'm going to be straight with you. Daniel is just the tip of the iceberg. He's part of something much bigger than you can imagine. A web of corruption that stretches across the entire city and beyond. And if you want to stop him, if you want to take him down, you need to understand what you're up against." Diane's head spun. She had thought that exposing Daniel's threats was the hard part, but now it seemed like she was only scratching the surface. There was something bigger at play, something that had been hidden in the shadows for far too long. "How do you know all this?" Diane asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman's eyes softened slightly. "Let's just say I've been where you are. I've been up against people like Daniel. I know how they operate, how they use their power to get what they want. But I also know how to fight back." Diane took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She had come here for answers, and now it seemed like the answers were more dangerous than she could have imagined. But she couldn't back down now. She had already exposed Daniel. She had already made a choice. "I'm ready," Diane said, her voice firm. The woman's eyes flickered with a trace of approval. "Good. Because this won't be easy. But if you want to bring Daniel down, if you want to make sure he never hurts anyone else again, you're going to have to get your hands dirty." Diane felt a chill run down her spine. Get your hands dirty? She had always thought of herself as a good person, someone who believed in justice, someone who believed in doing what was right. But now, it seemed like the world she had stepped into wasn't black and white. There were no easy answers. "I'll do whatever it takes," Diane said, her voice resolute. "I have to stop him." The woman nodded. "Good. Then let's get to work." As they exchanged a final look, the weight of the situation settled over Diane. This was the beginning of something much bigger than she had ever anticipated. And the further she went, the more she realized she was in over her head. But there was no turning back. She had made a choice. And now, she had to see it through, no matter what. As the woman led her deeper into the building, Diane couldn't help but wonder. Was she really ready for what was coming? Could she truly stop someone like Daniel? Someone who had so much power, so many connections? The answers were still unknown, but Diane was determined to find them. She wasn't going to let anyone, especially Daniel, take control of her life again. The fight for her future had only just begun. The inside of the abandoned building felt colder as the woman led Diane deeper into the shadows. The air was stale, the faint hum of electricity buzzing somewhere in the distance. Diane's heart beat louder in her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. The woman's sudden presence in her life, along with the cryptic promises of help, only deepened the mystery surrounding Daniel's empire. She didn't know what to believe anymore, but she had no choice but to follow. The woman stopped in front of a heavy metal door, pushing it open with ease. Inside, there was a room filled with monitors, wires, and stacks of files that looked hastily put together. The entire space felt like a command center, a place where decisions were made in secret, away from prying eyes. "Welcome to my world," the woman said, her voice low and matter-of-fact. "This is where we keep track of people like Daniel, and where we find the people who are brave enough to stand up to him." Diane looked around, trying to take it all in. The room wasn't huge, but it was efficient, organized chaos with everything in its place, even if it didn't seem that way at first glance. Screens flashed with information, and several phones were scattered on the desk, one of them buzzing with an incoming call. "Who are you?" Diane asked again, unable to hold back the question any longer. She needed to know who this woman really was and why she was helping her. The woman turned to face Diane fully now, her dark eyes unwavering. "My name is Elena. I've been tracking Daniel's movements for a long time. I've seen firsthand what he's capable of, and I've spent years trying to bring him down. I can't do it alone, though." "That's where you come in." Diane raised an eyebrow. "How do you know so much about me? Why would you trust me?" Elena let out a small, almost rueful smile. "Because you're already in this, Diane. You've exposed Daniel. You've forced his hand. He won't stop until he either silences you or destroys everything you've built. He's dangerous, but you can fight him." Diane felt a chill at the thought of Daniel's relentless pursuit. But she also felt something else, something that she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Elena wasn't just talking about taking down a lawyer. She was talking about a real fight, one that had consequences much bigger than just her own life. "What do we do next?" Diane asked, her voice steady, though she could feel the weight of her decision settling in. Elena's expression became serious. "We start by gathering intel. Daniel has connections everywhere: politics, business, even law enforcement. We need to know who's working for him, who's backing him, and what he's planning next. We need to find the cracks in his empire." Diane nodded. "And how do we do that?" Elena walked over to one of the desks and opened a file, flipping through the pages quickly. "We use his own methods against him. We tap into his networks, track his financials, get close to his associates. We find the weak links and exploit them. The truth is, Daniel is too confident. He believes he's untouchable. But that's where he's wrong." Diane took a deep breath, her mind swirling with the enormity of the task at hand. But it was the only path forward. Daniel had already shown how far he was willing to go to silence her. She couldn't let him win. Not after everything she had already sacrificed. "Are we alone in this?" Diane asked, a hint of worry in her voice. "I mean, you don't exactly have an army here." Elena's lips curled into a small smile. "No, but I have contacts. People who owe me favors. People who want Daniel taken down just as much as we do. It's going to be dangerous, but we're not alone." Diane felt the tension in her shoulders ease slightly. Having allies, even a small group, would make a huge difference. But the danger was still there. Every decision they made would bring them closer to Daniel, and with each step, the risk of being exposed would grow. "You said earlier that you've been tracking Daniel for years," Diane said, trying to understand Elena's background better. "Why now? Why are you helping me?" Elena paused, as if weighing her words. She turned toward one of the monitors and typed something in. The screen blinked to life, showing a series of documents that looked like records from police reports and surveillance footage. The images were blurry, but one name stood out: Daniel Carter. "I've been following him for a long time," Elena said, her voice suddenly hard. "And I've seen what he's capable of. He's ruined lives, taken down entire families, destroyed businesses. His influence stretches far and wide, but his arrogance has always been his downfall. He thinks he can control everything, and he's never faced anyone like me." Diane watched Elena closely, sensing the pain behind her words. There was more to this than just a vendetta against a corrupt lawyer. Elena had a personal stake in this fight, one that went beyond the desire for justice. She had lived through the kind of destruction that Daniel caused, and now she was fighting back. Diane cleared her throat, trying to push the overwhelming emotions aside. "So, What's our first move? Elena looked at her, eyes sharp. Our first move is to find out what Daniel's planning next. There's a big deal coming up, something that could give him the final push to secure his power. If we can stop that deal from going through, we can knock him off balance. Diane nodded, the weight of the task settling in her stomach. But there was no turning back now. She was in this fight for the long haul. If she wanted to bring Daniel down, she had to stay focused, stay smart, and trust the people who had her back. Let's do it, Diane said, her voice firm. Elena gave a brief nod. Good. We'll start with Daniel's finances. We need to track his money, his transactions. We can't take him down if we don't know where he's getting his power from. Elena quickly moved to another part of the room and began working on one of the computers, pulling up a list of bank accounts, offshore holdings, and financial statements. The work was intense, but Elena moved with precision, like someone who had done this 1,000 times before. Diane stood by, trying to keep her focus. She wasn't used to this kind of high-stakes operation. She had always thought of herself as someone who followed the rules, someone who believed in fairness and justice. But now, she was stepping into a world that was murky at best, dangerous at worst. As the hours passed, the silence in the room grew heavier. Diane could hear Elena typing rapidly, her fingers flying over the keyboard. Finally, Elena turned to her, her face lit by the glow of the screen. We've got something, Elena said, her voice low but triumphant. It looks like Daniel's been funneling money through a series of shell companies. If we follow the trail, we can get to the people he's working with, and that could lead us straight to his biggest supporters. Diane's heart raced. This was it. This was the break they needed. She had been hoping for something, anything, that could crack open Daniel's carefully constructed empire. And now, they had a lead. But just as Diane was about to respond, a loud bang echoed through the building, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps approaching fast. Elena's eyes snapped toward the door, her face draining of color. They're here, she muttered under her breath. Diane's blood ran cold. Who is here? And before she could react, the door to the room burst open, and a group of men in dark suits stormed in, guns drawn, their eyes scanning the room. Diane's breath caught in her throat. It was Daniel. The men in dark suits flooded into the room with an air of precision, their movements coordinated as if they'd rehearsed this many times before. Diane's pulse hammered in her chest, and her instinct screamed at her to run, but there was nowhere to go. The door was blocked, and the windows were too high to escape through. She had walked right into a trap. Elena's face hardened in an instant, her calm demeanor faltering for the briefest moment, but she quickly regained her composure, standing tall as the men closed in on them. One of the men, a tall figure with dark sunglasses, stepped forward, his eyes locked on Elena. Elena, I assume, he said, his voice icy and calm. His gaze flicked to Diane. And you must be Diane Harper. Diane's throat went dry. Her heart pounded so loudly in her ears that she almost couldn't hear the man's voice. She looked at Elena, silently pleading for some kind of explanation, but Elena's expression was unreadable, her lips pressed tight in a thin line. Elena didn't speak immediately, her eyes scanning the group of men who had surrounded them. She was calculating, always thinking ahead. Diane could feel the tension in the air, the sense of danger that seemed to seep into every corner of the room. These men weren't just here to intimidate. They were here to finish what Daniel had started. Finally, Elena broke the silence, her voice steady. I should have known he would send you after me. You've been following me for a while now, haven't you? She didn't wait for a response. But it's not me you should be worried about, it's her. Elena gestured subtly toward Diane. The man with sunglasses didn't flinch. We know all about her. We also know you've been keeping track of Mr. Carter's business. That ends tonight. Diane's mind raced. Mr. Carter? She had no idea what they were planning, but the threat in the man's voice made it clear that they weren't just here for a chat. Elena's posture didn't change. You think you can intimidate us into backing off? I've been doing this long enough to know that threats won't get you anywhere. The tall man's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I'm not here to threaten anyone. I'm here to make sure this little game ends before it gets out of hand. And trust me, Elena, if you think you can beat us, you're wrong. The tension in the room was suffocating. Diane could feel her breath growing shallow, panic rising in her chest, but she forced herself to stay still. She had to think clearly. She had no idea how Elena had gotten involved with these people, but she knew one thing for sure. They weren't just here to scare her. They wanted to destroy everything she had worked for. "Listen," Elena said, her voice a shade colder. "I've been through worse than you. Your threats mean nothing to me. You're wasting your time." The man narrowed his eyes at her, his gaze turning venomous. "You know, it's funny. You think you're so clever, but you're just a part of a much bigger problem. And this time, you're not going to get away." As the man spoke, Elena's eyes flicked briefly to the side, and Diane instinctively followed her gaze. There, on the wall near the far corner of the room, was a small, inconspicuous light. A camera. Diane's heart skipped a beat. "They've been watching us." Elena's eyes met hers, and there was a silent understanding between them. They had to get out of here. Now, the tall man took a step closer, raising his hand to give the signal to his men. Diane's mind was in overdrive, but she could feel the heat of the moment pressing down on her. Without warning, Elena moved swiftly, knocking over a nearby chair to create a distraction. As the men turned their attention toward the noise, Elena grabbed Diane's arm and yanked her toward the door, her movements fast and decisive. Diane's heart was in her throat as they dashed for the exit. She could hear the sound of footsteps behind them, the men shouting for them to stop, but Elena didn't slow down. They burst out into the dark hallway, the sound of their shoes echoing in the silence. Elena didn't look back as she pulled Diane through the corridors. The building's layout was confusing, a maze of narrow hallways and stairs, but Elena seemed to know exactly where she was going. "They'll be on us in seconds," Elena muttered, urgency in her voice. "We need to move faster." They rounded a corner and found a back door. Elena slammed it open, revealing a narrow alleyway outside, dimly lit by a single street lamp. It wasn't much, but it was a way out. They didn't waste time. Elena pushed Diane ahead, urging her to run. They sprinted down the alley, adrenaline coursing through Diane's veins. She could hear the distant shouts from the men inside the building, but they were too far behind to catch up immediately. Diane glanced over her shoulder. For a split second, she thought she saw one of the men emerging from the door, but they were too far away to make out clearly. She didn't care. She just needed to keep moving. They turned a corner, heading toward a street where Elena's car was parked. But as they reached the end of the alley, Diane's eyes widened in horror. A black SUV was waiting for them, parked right at the end of the alley, blocking their escape route. Before she could even react, the door of the SUV opened, and Daniel's voice rang out, chilling and cold. "I must admit, you two are fast," Daniel said, his figure stepping out from the shadows. "But not fast enough." Diane froze, her stomach dropping. How had he gotten here so quickly? How much had he planned? She glanced at Elena, but Elena's face was grim. They had nowhere to go. The men from the building had caught up, and they were closing in fast. Daniel took a step toward them, his eyes narrowing. "You're out of your depth, Diane. You thought you could play the hero, but you've made a mess of things. Now, it's time for you to face the consequences." Diane's pulse raced, but she wasn't ready to give up yet. She glanced at Elena again, silently begging for a plan. They couldn't be cornered now. They needed a way out. Elena's eyes flicked to the alleyway behind them, and then back to Daniel, her lips pressing into a thin line. "We don't have to do this," she said, her voice surprisingly calm. "You've already lost." Daniel's lips curled into a mock smile. "You think you're in control? You think you've got the upper hand? You're just a few steps from being in the ground with your little rebellion. It's over." Diane's mind raced. It can't be over. Not now. And then, something unexpected happened. Elena reached into her coat, pulling out something small and silver. Before Diane could even blink, she saw Elena press a button on the device, and suddenly, the alleyway around them lit up, bright, blinding light, flashing in every direction. Diane squinted, unable to see through the intense brightness. And then, in the chaos, she heard Elena's voice, sharp and commanding. "Run." Diane didn't need another word. She sprinted as fast as she could, Elena close behind her. The blinding light provided them the cover they needed to escape the clutches of Daniel and his men. The world around them blurred as they ran, but Diane couldn't shake the feeling that no matter how far they ran, Daniel's reach was never far behind. And the game they were playing had just begun. Diane's legs burned as she ran, her breath ragged and shallow, but she didn't dare slow down. The flashing lights from Elena's device were still blinding, and the sound of shuffling footsteps behind them grew fainter as they pushed farther into the streets. For a moment, Diane thought they might have escaped, but she knew better than to relax just yet. Daniel's reach was too far, and he wouldn't stop until they were caught. "Elena, where are we going?" Diane gasped, glancing over her shoulder. The alleyway was now quiet, the distant sounds of pursuit fading. But that could change in an instant. "Keep running," Elena urged, her voice low but steady. "We can't stop yet. We've got to get to a safe house." The term safe house sent a shiver down Diane's spine. This wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. It was a full-on war. They had entered a world of shadows and deception, where every corner could hide a trap, and every moment counted. Diane's mind was racing, but the weight of what had just happened was impossible to ignore. They had barely made it out of that building, and now Daniel's men were surely regrouping, ready to come after them. How long could they keep running? How much longer could Elena protect her? Diane couldn't help but feel that each step forward took them deeper into danger, with no clear way out. They rounded another corner, and Elena pulled Diane into an alley that was even more hidden than the last. The streetlights were dim here, the only sound the occasional rustling of a plastic bag blowing across the pavement. It felt like a different world altogether. Elena stopped suddenly and turned to Diane. "We're almost there. Just keep moving." Diane nodded, but her mind kept turning over the same questions. What was this all really about? She had thought she was just testifying against a corrupt lawyer, but now she had stumbled into something much larger, something far more dangerous than she could ever have imagined. How deep did Daniel's influence run? Who were these people helping Elena, and could she trust them? As if reading her mind, Elena spoke again, her voice softer this time. "I know you're scared, but trust me, what we're doing is the right thing. Daniel has too much power, and he won't stop. Not unless we stop him first." Diane took a deep breath, steadying herself. "But how? We've barely made it out alive. How do we stop someone like him?" Elena paused, her eyes narrowing as she looked toward the darkened street ahead. "By hitting him where it hurts most. We go after his empire, his money, his connections. We break down everything he's built, and when it all comes crumbling down, he'll have nowhere to hide." Diane nodded, trying to push aside the fear that threatened to swallow her whole. She didn't know if they could really bring down someone as powerful as Daniel, but she also knew she had no other choice. She couldn't go back to her old life. She couldn't let him win. After a few more twists and turns, Elena stopped in front of a small, nondescript building. It looked like any other apartment complex in the area, unremarkable, hidden in plain sight. Elena led her inside, and the door clicked shut behind them with a quiet finality. "This is it," Elena said, her voice low as she took Diane's coat and hung it on a hook by the door. "This is where we regroup. You'll be safe here for now." Diane glanced around the small apartment. It was modest, with minimal furniture, but it felt secure, like a fortress of sorts. There was a couch, a small table, and several computers and papers scattered across the room. "This is where you've been working?" Diane asked, a bit overwhelmed by the sheer amount of information on the table. Papers, files, photographs, they all seemed to lead back to Daniel. "Yes," Elena replied, moving toward the desk. "I've been gathering information on Daniel for months. I've infiltrated some of his associates, learned their patterns. But it's not enough. We need to go bigger. We need allies, people who can help us dismantle his operations." Diane frowned. "Allies? Who do you have in mind?" Elena's gaze softened. "I've got a few contacts in law enforcement, people who are fed up with Daniel's games. But we need to act fast. Every minute we waste gives him more time to cover his tracks. He'll try to destroy any evidence we have, and he'll come after us with everything he has. We need to hit him now, before he has a chance to regroup." Diane took a seat at the small kitchen table, her hands trembling. How could this have all spiraled out of control so quickly? But there was no going back. She had made her choice, and now she had to see it through. She couldn't let Daniel get away with what he had done. "I'm ready," Diane said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "What's our next move?" Elena nodded approvingly. "We start by exposing his financial dealings. If we can get access to his offshore accounts and the people he's paying, we can cripple him. The money trail will lead us straight to his associates, and that's where we can start breaking down his empire." Diane swallowed, the gravity of their mission weighing on her. "And if we're wrong? What if this backfires?" Elena's eyes hardened. "Then we'll deal with it. But we don't have a choice, Diane. This is our only chance." For a long moment, they sat in silence, the weight of their decisions hanging in the air. The hours of planning, the danger, the risk, it was all starting to feel too much. But in the end, it wasn't about them. It was about stopping someone who had hurt too many people and who wouldn't stop until he had everything under his control. Diane stood up, her resolve hardening. "Let's do it," she said, her voice sharp with determination. "Let's take him down." Elena nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "That's the spirit. We'll start first thing in the morning. For now, get some rest. We'll need all the energy we can muster for what comes next." Diane knew she wouldn't be able to sleep, but she didn't protest. There was no time for rest now. The clock was ticking, and Daniel wasn't going to wait. As she lay down on the couch, her mind raced with thoughts of what was to come. Every moment was a risk, every move could be their last. But she had made a promise to herself. She was going to fight back, and she wasn't going to let anyone stop her. Not Daniel, not anyone. The morning came far too quickly for Diane. She had barely slept, the weight of everything pressing down on her chest. Her thoughts were a swirl of worry, fear, and determination. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Daniel's cold stare, felt the heat of the chase, and heard the sound of footsteps pounding after her. He wouldn't stop. Not now. Not ever. Elena had been up before her, already at the desk, her eyes scanning through files and documents with methodical precision. The place was still quiet, the kind of quiet that felt almost too heavy. Diane watched her for a moment before pushing herself off the couch and heading to the small kitchen. She needed something to clear her head. Coffee, maybe. "You're up early," Diane said, trying to keep her voice light. Elena didn't look up from the screen. "We don't have time to waste. Every second counts. If we don't make a move today, Daniel will find a way to shut us down." Diane nodded, knowing she couldn't argue. They had come too far to hesitate now. She poured herself a cup of coffee and took a sip, the bitterness doing little to calm the storm inside her. Elena turned away from the desk and finally met Diane's eyes. "We're starting with the financials. I've got a contact who can help us get into Daniel's private accounts, but we'll need to be quick. He won't take kindly to anyone poking around in his business. The key is to get the information and disappear before he notices." Diane set her coffee down, her heart skipping a beat at the mention of a contact. "How do you know you can trust them?" Elena's expression softened briefly, her lips pressing into a thin line. "You don't always get to choose who you trust. But in this case, I'm willing to take the risk. We have no choice." Diane's stomach churned. She didn't like the uncertainty of it all, but Elena was right. They had to take risks if they were going to succeed. The moment they stopped moving forward, they'd lose. And right now, failure wasn't an option. "Okay," Diane said, the words more for herself than anyone else. "What do we need to do?" Elena opened a drawer and pulled out a small, unmarked envelope. She handed it to Diane. "Take this. It contains the details of our contact. They're waiting for you at an old cafe on 5th. It's a public place, so you should be safe. But don't talk to anyone else there. Just go in, get the information, and leave." Diane took the envelope, the weight of it in her hand feeling heavier than she expected. She hadn't realized how much danger they were really in until now. Until Elena laid everything out so simply, so matter-of-fact. She could feel the unease rising in her chest again, but she forced herself to stay calm. "I'll go," Diane said, her voice firm despite the doubt gnawing at her. "You'll stay here?" Elena nodded. I'll monitor everything from here. I've set up a few things to make sure we're not followed. If you're spotted, or if anything goes wrong, I'll get you out. But I trust you can handle yourself." Diane hesitated, her fingers brushing the edge of the envelope. It was a small task, but it felt like it could be the pivotal moment in their fight against Daniel. It was a moment where things could either go terribly wrong or fall into place. "I'll be back soon," Diane said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. Elena gave a quick nod, but there was something in her eyes that made Diane wonder if the older woman was hiding her own doubts. "Just be careful, Diane. Don't trust anyone who's not on our side." Diane took one last deep breath, grabbed her coat, and left the apartment. The cold outside air hit her face like a slap, but it didn't slow her down. She kept her head down, her steps brisk as she walked toward the cafe Elena had mentioned. It wasn't far, just a few blocks away, but every step felt like a countdown to something she wasn't sure she was ready for. The cafe was tucked into the corner of a quiet street, a place where the clink of cups and the murmur of voices created a comforting ambience. It looked normal enough, and that made Diane even more suspicious. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that every face in the crowd could be a threat. She pushed open the door and stepped inside, the warmth of the cafe greeting her like a soft blanket. Her eyes quickly scanned the room for anyone suspicious, but the place seemed ordinary, just a few people scattered around, sipping coffee, talking quietly. No one seemed to pay her any mind. At the back corner, a man sat alone, his face mostly obscured by a newspaper. Diane hesitated for a moment before walking over to the table. He didn't look up, but she knew it was him. She took a seat across from him, trying to keep her breathing even. She couldn't let anyone see how nervous she was. The man didn't speak at first, just folded his newspaper and set it aside. His eyes were sharp, dark, like he had been waiting for her. "You're Diane Harper," he said, his voice low and clipped. Diane nodded, her throat tight. "And you're the contact?" He didn't answer directly. Instead, he slid a small, folded piece of paper across the table toward her. Diane hesitated for a moment before taking it, unfolding it carefully. The message was simple, but it sent a chill through her. "The account details are in the envelope. We've set up a transfer to a third-party location. No trace. You know what to do." Diane's heart skipped a beat. She didn't like the sound of no trace. It meant they had to cover their tracks, completely. But this was the opportunity they'd been waiting for. If they could take down Daniel's finances, they could strike at the heart of his operation. She looked up at the man, but before she could say anything else, he was already standing, his movements swift and deliberate. "Time's running out," he muttered, turning and walking toward the door. Diane stayed seated, her hand gripping the envelope tightly. She glanced around, trying to appear casual, but every instinct told her to leave before things got too complicated. She waited for a few moments, watching the man disappear into the crowd, then stood up, clutching the envelope to her chest. But just as she was about to leave, something caught her eye, a flash of movement by the window. She froze. There, across the street, she saw a familiar figure watching her. A figure she never thought she'd see again. It was Daniel. The realization hit her like a punch in the gut. He had been watching her all along. Her mind raced, and she turned quickly, trying to keep her movements steady. She needed to get out of here now. But as she reached the door, the bell above it jingled, and she saw a group of men in dark suits step inside. They didn't look like they were there for coffee. Diane's breath caught in her throat. This was it. Daniel had found her. And now, there was no way out. Diane's heart pounded in her chest, each beat like a ticking clock. The men in dark suits stepped into the cafe, scanning the room with unsettling precision. She didn't need to look again to know who they were. They were Daniel's men, and they weren't here for coffee. They were here for her. She turned quickly, gripping the envelope tight in her hand, her pulse racing. She needed a plan, and she needed it fast. Every moment felt like it stretched on forever, but she had no time to waste. The men weren't looking directly at her yet, but their presence made it clear that they were closing in. With a quick glance over her shoulder, Diane made her move. She pushed open the door and stepped out into the cool, bustling street, trying to blend in with the crowd. She didn't look back, knowing the risk of drawing attention would only make things worse. Her breath caught in her throat as she ducked into an alleyway, heart pounding in her ears. What now? She thought. There was no way to outrun Daniel's men. Not on foot, not in a crowded city. They were trained, coordinated. She had no chance unless she thought quickly. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Diane pulled it out, her hand trembling as she saw Elena's name flash on the screen. Diane, get out of there now. Elena's voice was sharp, laced with panic. They know where you are. You need to lose them before they trap you. Diane's mind raced as she glanced over her shoulder, her eyes flicking from one dark alley to the next. She was running out of options. Elena, I can't get out. They're everywhere. Elena's right. A voice said from behind her, smooth and sinister. Diane froze. The man she had seen earlier, one of Daniel's men, stood at the alley's entrance, his posture confident, his hand resting on the side of his gun. You should have left this game when you had the chance. Diane's heart sank, her mind going blank. So close, she thought. She had tried. She had given everything she had to expose Daniel. But now she was cornered, the walls closing in on her with no way out. You don't have to do this, Diane said, her voice steady despite the fear rising in her chest. I've already got what I need. You can't stop it. The man smirked, taking a slow step toward her. You think Daniel's empire is just going to crumble because you're holding a piece of paper? He's already on top. You're already too late. Diane's grip tightened on the envelope in her hand, and her fingers brushed the device hidden inside it. She had to act now. This was her last chance. With a flash of resolve, she pressed the button inside the envelope, triggering the hidden device. The moment she did, a series of explosive noises echoed from the alley ahead. Blinding flashes of light filled the space. The man flinched, his hand reaching for his gun. But it was too late. The flash bomb Elena had planted was disorienting enough to give Diane the time she needed. She darted to the side, weaving through the alley and using the confusion to her advantage. She didn't stop running. She couldn't afford to look back. As her feet pounded the pavement, Diane's phone buzzed again, and this time, it was Elena's voice that broke through her thoughts. Diane, we've got your back. Keep moving. We've set up an exit route. Diane didn't hesitate. With Elena's plan in motion, her only job was to escape, and escape she did. The streets blurred past her, each turn taken with a sense of desperation. She kept moving, knowing that once she was out of the city, she would be safe, at least for a while. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Diane reached the rendezvous point, an old, inconspicuous van parked on the corner of a quieter street. She threw herself into the back without a word, and the door slammed shut behind her, muffling the sounds of the city. Elena was already inside, her face illuminated by the dim light of a nearby street lamp. You made it, Elena said, her voice tight with relief. Diane sank back into the seat, closing her eyes for a moment. The adrenaline was fading, but the exhaustion remained. She didn't know where they were going, only that it didn't matter as long as they were out of Daniel's reach. We're not done yet, Diane said, her voice barely above a whisper, but filled with the fierce resolve that had gotten her this far. This isn't the end. We still have to take him down. Elena nodded, her eyes hardening with determination. No, this is just the beginning. We hit him where it hurts now. We take down everything he's built. As the van sped off into the night, Diane's mind buzzed with a single thought. She had survived, but the battle wasn't over. Daniel would never stop, but neither would she. For now, though, Diane let herself breathe. She had won this round, and as long as she was alive, she would keep fighting. They were taking the fight to Daniel, and this time, it was personal. And with that, the road ahead seemed uncertain, but Diane knew one thing for sure. She would never back down. The war had just begun. Diane sat in the van, her heart still racing but slowly beginning to calm as the distance between her and Daniel grew. The city lights faded into the background, the rush of escape gradually giving way to the quiet hum of the road beneath them. As the van's engine whirred, Diane's mind replayed everything that had led her here. The chase, the threats, the near misses, and the path that lay ahead. She had fought back when most people would have given up. She had stood up to Daniel, exposed him, and when it seemed like the world would crush her under its weight, she kept moving forward. It was that drive, that refusal to give in, that kept her alive. In the seat beside her, Elena was silent, her fingers tapping out a rhythm against her phone, perhaps planning their next move. There was no safety in hiding for long, no comfort in thinking they were out of danger. Diane knew that. But there was also strength in the fact that they had taken the first step toward destroying Daniel's empire, an empire built on lies, threats, and manipulation. For all of Daniel's power, he had underestimated one thing: the power of truth. And as long as Diane had breath in her lungs, she would make sure that truth found its way to the world, no matter the cost. The road stretched on, long and uncertain. But Diane knew one thing now: she was no longer just a victim. She was a fighter, and the fight was far from over. But this time, she wasn't alone. She had allies, she had a plan, and she had the courage to face whatever came next. In the end, it wasn't just about survival. It was about justice. And justice, Diane knew, was something worth fighting for.